Good morning. This is Senator Dick Black, retired senator, and we are going to discuss today the facts that as the hopes for a Ukrainian victory in the war are fading, the question is becoming very timely. Will NATO attack Russia directly? And there has been a lot of activity going on diplomatically and so forth that makes us very nervous that there may be plans or hopes to enlarge the struggle. So here we are. It is March the 11th, 2024, and we had hoped to have our friend Jim Jatras on. He's a great expert in foreign policy, but he has texted me this morning, and he's en route to Belgrade, and so I'd like to discuss this because it's a very important topic. You know, the Biden administration followed up on what began with President Obama. Obama had overthrown the government of Ukraine through a coup, an unlawful coup in 2014, and through Victoria Nuland and folks like that, he was able to install a revolutionary junta that began a massive military buildup along the border with Russia. Now, it was actually Ukrainian territory at that time in the Donbass, but the people there were Russian speakers. They were culturally Russian, and it was very close to the Russian border. So it was very threatening to Russia, and we knew that it would be threatening, and we knew that if we pushed hard enough and long enough, that it would force Russia into the war, and this is what happened. The NATO powers started making noises about the possibility of admitting Ukraine to NATO. Now, by putting Ukraine to NATO, NATO had said that the decision whether to allow nuclear weapons within a country's borders was up to that particular member of NATO. So had Ukraine been absorbed by NATO, and had they made the decision, which they inevitably would have, to station nuclear weapons within Ukraine, then there would be no buffer at all between the moment when Ukraine fired nuclear missiles at Moscow and the time when they struck. You know, it's just a matter of a few minutes. There wouldn't have been time to react. It would have created a tremendous danger of nuclear war for the entire world. But the people formulating American foreign policy over recent decades, last couple of decades, since George Bush, have been, I'm not terribly bright, far-looking people. They're not very visionary, and they don't seem to have a three-dimensional grasp of events moving within the world. And so Obama moved forward with his plans to build up this big army. The big army, the Ukrainian army attacking the Donbass, conducted a war that went on for quite a number of years from 2014 onward, killed I think about 14,000 people. And mostly they were civilians because there were very few military targets within the Donbass area of Ukraine on the Russian border. So what has happened now, of course, under Biden, Biden refused to listen to Russian overtures, peace overtures, and eventually forced Russia, as an act of self-defense, to attack into Ukraine, and then when it looked like the parties to the war, when Ukraine and Russia had sat down and hammered out a peace agreement just 2 months after the war began, very few casualties, very little property damage. And the two parties were so close to an agreement that the Ukrainian negotiator actually went back to Kiev, to the capital, and told all the press that that they were on the verge of a peace deal. And then President Biden, and probably coordinated with Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom, and Boris Johnson flew unexpectedly to Kiev and basically read the riot act to Zelensky and said, we got a lot riding on this thing. You're not just simply going to make peace and walk away. And so the peace deal was scrapped, and subsequently probably a minimum of 500,000 people have died, tremendous property damage. Ukraine has been just devastated. They become a nation of widows and orphans. But there were billionaires with tremendous amount of money at stake. They made big bets on being able to buy up Ukrainian property for pennies on the dollar, and they had some hopes that they might be able to do the same with Russia if Ukraine could attack and seize Moscow somehow, which was a bizarre thought, but I think they were serious about it. Had that happened, then NATO, the U.S. and NATO, would have broken up Russia and basically looted the country of its natural resources, which are very vast, by the way. But in any event, so all of this has happened, and the United States helped to plan this huge Ukrainian counteroffensive that began summer of 2023. The U.S. and some NATO generals and the generals from Ukraine actually did these sand table exercises, everything mapped out, and they sort of tested concepts for how the Ukraine would be able to burst through the Russian defenses and drive deeply south, and perhaps cut off Crimea, and basically then move forward to collapse Russia all through the area that it occupied and had captured in Ukraine. As it turned out, the huge Ukrainian counteroffensive that involved many thousands of men and tremendous numbers of tanks, Western tanks, from the U.S., from UK, from Germany, and other countries. They charged into battle in the southern part of Ukraine, and the plan was an utter failure. The Russian defense lines had been extremely well constructed. Their engineering, their design, their manning by troops. Russia had managed to enlarge its forces considerably, and So when Ukraine attacked in the summer, in June, it was a bloody slaughterhouse. They smashed into Russian minefields. You had scenes where there were multiple tanks that were crashing into one another, exploding. There were Bradley vehicles being blown up, and it was a terrible thing. It was such a tragedy to happen to Ukraine because they had their best troops, and in the end, Ukraine lost 166,000 men killed and wounded. Tremendous loss of men, and in any event, Russia's losses were light. They were in excellent defensive positions. They suffered many killed and wounded, but their losses were very light relative to Ukraine's. Now, because of this, Ukraine at this point has expended all of its reserves. Its manpower base back within the country has dwindled, and they just don't have the people to do it. It's not that they aren't courageous fighters. They've been very good fighters, but it's very much like the Confederacy during the Civil War. The Confederate soldiers were magnificent soldiers. They fought courageously, and in the end, the Confederate States were simply bled of manpower by the Union, which had much larger population, and they were forced to accept peace. This is what I call the Appomattox moment, the time when Robert E. Lee was forced to surrender to Ulysses S. Grant. A very sort of a heart-wrenching moment for many Americans at that point, and so we've reached that point where the Appomattox moment is approaching for Ukraine. Wars are very uncertain, so you can only guesstimate at what happens. But Ukraine is in a very desperate situation, and just on the night of the State of the Union address delivered by Biden, and I'm going to get back to that in a moment, the Vatican released excerpts from an interview that Pope Francis had done with a Swiss broadcaster. And the Pope said, and I'll quote, "I think the strongest one is the one who looks at the situation, thinks about the people, and has the courage of the white flag and negotiates." Now he's talking about, this really is his recommendation to Ukraine, is to show the white flag and go into negotiations to end the war. And Pope Francis also said, quote, "When you see that you are defeated, that things are not going well, you have to have the courage to negotiate." So I think to some extent, Pope Francis's comments reflect the reality of the situation that Ukraine faces right now. Now, let me get back to President Biden, because on that same night, President Biden was delivering the State of the Union address. The first item that he talked about, the lead, was the war in Ukraine. He didn't talk about inflation. Now, I'm not saying he didn't talk about these things later, but in the beginning, he didn't lead off with inflation, with the broken southern border, with crime and corruption in the cities, with all of this array of domestic concerns that has the country in turmoil. Instead, he focuses across the globe to the Ukraine war. And he describes it in sort of an eerie fashion, because he tries to suggest that this is like World War II, and that this is sort of this heroic effort, and sort of the United States getting itself together and going off and fighting the Nazis, and siding with the Soviet Union and helping the Soviet Union to defeat the Germans and Western Europeans, and this was like the heroic. Now, in this case, instead of fighting as an ally of the Soviet Union and an enemy of Germany, we this time are fighting as an ally of Germany and an enemy of Russia. But in any event, here's what's important: is in the course of his discussion, he started talking about that we've got to help Ukraine. We've got to give them, many more billions of dollars. Another 61 billion package is going through the Senate. Not all of it for Ukraine, but most of it. And then he said that we will not send American troops. That's not what we're talking about. We're just going to help in every way that we can, but we will not send American troops. Now, it's paradoxical and it's ironic, but history shows us that whenever a United States president promises not to send in U.S. troops, it is generally the case that the U.S. is close to sending American troops. And this has been carried out many times in the past. It's sort of a way of disarming the public, where the public says, "Oh, thank goodness, this is what a wonderful president. He is going to keep the nation at peace." And it doesn't work that way. Now, in 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson campaigned, his political campaign, and the reason that he was able to be victorious was that he campaigned on a promise of peace in Southeast Asia, particularly peace in Vietnam. And he said, and I quote from Lyndon B. Johnson, "We are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." A year later, he landed Marines in Da Nang, and the U.S. fought a bloody war that lasted 10 years and cost 58,000 men's lives. Now, at the time of this, I had studied from the time I was just a very young boy. I was intrigued by foreign policy, military affairs, and so forth. So by this time, when Lyndon B. Johnson spoke, he spoke at the time of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And I was in VT-1 squadron at Pensacola, Florida, in the recreation room, playing pool with other pilots who were playing pool, drinking beer. TV announcer came on and said, "We interrupt this show for an important address by the president, who will be speaking from the Oval Office." after Lyndon Johnson came on, he spoke about the North Vietnamese attacking the U.S. destroyer Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin, and said that he had ordered American planes to respond, and he suggested this was going to be a limited response. And he says, and this was a quote from Lyndon Johnson, we Americans know, although others appear to forget, the risks of spreading conflict. We seek no wider war. But as he spoke, the Pentagon was preparing for a far larger ground engagement. And I remember, as we had all clustered around the one TV set in the recreation room, and after the president faded from the screen, they switched off the set. There was no more loud, joyous chatter by all the guys standing around in their flight suits, but there was sort of a sober tone that took hold. And I was playing with a naval aviation cadet. I was a Marine aviation cadet, and the Navy cadet, fellow named Cupper, he turned and he asked me. He said, "What do you think of that?" And I told him, "It means we're going to war." I was right. And over the next few years, many of the pilots who were in that recreation room that night playing pool were killed or wounded doing what LBJ said we would never do. And let me just give you one more, and I could write a book on examples of this, but in a 2013 major address to the nation, President Obama said, and I want to quote a little bit of this. He said, "Many of you have asked, won't this put us on a slippery slope to another war?" Now, Obama was at the time proposing to launch what he called limited strikes on Syria in response to their using gas. That was the pretext, was the supposed use of gas. So he says, "Many of you have asked, won't this put us on a slippery slope to another war?" One man wrote me that we are still recovering from our involvement in Iraq. A veteran put it more bluntly, "This nation is sick and tired of war." My answer is simple. I will not put American boots on the ground in Syria. Now, at the time, the President Obama, was trying to rally support to attack and weaken Syria, which was holding off Al-Qaeda. Now, Al-Qaeda is the group that attacked the Twin Towers and the Pentagon on 9/11. You would think that would have been an enemy of America forever, but no, we were working in support of Al-Qaeda, and they were attempting to overthrow Syria, and we thought we could control them if they were our people, so ironically, as he was giving this lengthy address, trying to rally public support for attacking Syria and starting a new war there, this is Obama. He says, "It's true that some of Assad's opponents are extremists," President Assad of Syria says, "It's true that some of Assad's opponents are extremists, but Al-Qaeda will only draw strength in a more chaotic Syria if people there see the world doing nothing to prevent innocent civilians from being gassed to death." Well, as it turns out, it was Al-Qaeda that was doing the gassing, and they actually took President Assad and the Syrian government totally by surprise. And then the United States turned around and blamed blamed President Assad for gassing his own capital city. I mean, it was bizarre, but only in America can politicians present such shameful distortions to the American people and get away with it because the media goes along with it. But I thought it was ironic that here was the President of the United States admitting that the beneficiary of his attack would be Al-Qaeda, the very force that attacked the Twin Towers. And for those of you who were not old enough at the time in the Twin Towers, after they were engulfed in flames and people were driven higher and higher, there were considerable numbers, I mean, dozens and dozens of people who chose to jump to their death, and they fell about a quarter of a mile. It took quite a while for somebody to fall that distance. And then there were people just splatting on the pavements. And the whole country was in horror at watching. This was Al-Qaeda hijacking the planes, flying the planes. And here was President Obama. And it may have been a slip on his part to mention, and he mentioned in his speech, but Al-Qaeda will only draw strength in a more chaotic Syria, such and so and so. So it was clear that they were the beneficiaries. But after all of this, by 2015, President Obama ordered boots on the ground in Syria. Now, USA Today that year, 2015, they reported that Barack Obama had made 16 public statements saying that he would not allow boots on the ground in Syria. But 2015, American troops began invading and occupying northern Syria and a large desert area called Al-Tanf in the south. We captured Syria's oil wells, and they have a vast breadbasket of Syria. It's very productive wheat land, and we captured that. And the plan was to impose a famine on Syria in order to raise up the flagging fortunes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, so that they could rise up again and push back the Syrians and perhaps win the war. And so to this day, the United States maintains a clearly unlawful occupation of a sovereign nation. We crossed their sovereign borders. We invaded, we seized northern Syria, and we have the area in southern Syria. This is the kind of thing that we were accusing Russia. Well, Russia crossed the sovereign borders of Ukraine. How many times have we crossed sovereign borders? There's hardly a year that goes by we don't cross somebody's borders, but we certainly did it with Syria, and so in any event, so what's going on now is we've now got Emmanuel Macron of France, and he is telling people that the fact is that things are not going well in Ukraine, and he says that we need to be willing. He expressed a willingness, I would say, to send French troops to fight in Russia, to fight with Russia in Ukraine. And so this came as a great shock. This was right around the time that Biden had given his big pro-Ukraine State of the Union address. And here we have French President Macron saying, well, we need to be willing to send troops. He said that apparently, he said Western countries, I think he meant NATO, had met and they couldn't arrive at a consensus about whether to send troops into Ukraine, but that France was willing to do so. And when France did that, President Putin immediately warned that for NATO troops to enter Ukraine would have tragic consequences. And he emphasized that Russia's nuclear forces are in full readiness. Now, understand that once you have NATO moving into Ukraine and you have this tremendous Russian army fighting along the, not too far from the Russian border, the World War III is simply inevitable. And the chances that it will be non-nuclear are remote. So what we're talking about, and remember, when Macron says, Macron made the statement, he said nothing should be off the table, including presumably nuclear force, because remember, France is the fourth largest nuclear power on Earth. And so when he says nothing is off the table, that is a very dark and sinister comment coming from the president of France. So what we have is we've got President Putin obviously very concerned about this meeting that was held and the comments made by Emmanuel Macron. And so he pointed out, he said, look, he said, nuclear forces are in full readiness in Russia. And he mentioned the Sarmat heavy intercontinental ballistic missile. He mentioned the Burevestnik atomic-powered cruise missiles. And he mentioned the Poseidon atomic-powered nuclear-armed drone, which presumably would knock out all of America's aircraft carriers. And he said, and this is a quote from Putin, he said, they must understand that we also have weapons that can hit targets on their territory. And he warned of tragic consequences if NATO forces were ever deployed to Ukraine. And then he says, quote, all this really threatens a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons and the destruction of civilization. Don't they get that? Now, this is Putin saying that. Now, when Putin says that, he is very serious in warning of nuclear war. He doesn't want nuclear war. He wants to head it off. I've studied Putin for many years, since he was first sworn in. He's a very highly intelligent individual. He is a very steady hand at the tiller. He is not emotional or irrational. He's a very, very rational person. But he is determined, and he means exactly what he says. He doesn't want war, but he intends to follow Russian military doctrine that says that if NATO threatens Russia's territorial integrity, then nuclear forces are available, and that Russia will consider the use of them. Remember, under Russian law, Crimea and the Donbass are now parts of Russia. And we could say, oh, a lot of countries haven't yet recognized those places as being part of Russia. And this is true, but it's also irrelevant. President Putin is the president of Russia. He's not looking to see who recognizes what. He is looking to Russian law, and Russian law says that those are part of Russia. And so when he examines the military doctrine, he knows that if the decision has to be made to use nuclear weapons, that he is not in conflict with the law of Russia in the way that the doctrine is applied. Now, you need to understand, it's not as though the United States has not made aggressive moves already towards being involved in conflict in Ukraine. There are published reports. I have no secret information. Everything that I report to you is always open source. But we know that the 101st Airborne Division is heavily in Romania. There are a number of installations there. And 101st stands ready to cross the border with Ukraine. We've got Marines in Norway, and there are elements of V-Corps, which are in Poland. So the United States is poised for a major scale up of operations and a movement into Ukraine. Now, this is something that you say, well, why in the world will we do this? Because this is so insane. You need to understand that there is an enormous foreign affairs apparatus, sometimes called the deep state. It's a part of the deep state. And this involves the globalists, what I call the boys from Davos, and you've got all of these NATO people, all these think tanks, all the arms industries, and a lot of these people owe all of their prestige, their family wealth and well-being to the continuation of the enlargement of NATO and this effort to somehow put the entire world under the one world order, where the sovereignty of nations is constantly diminished, often through immigration, by breaking up the cohesion of the native-born people, flooding in people from all different cultures and so forth. And in any event, the movement of the deep state is towards abolishing sovereign nations, having a sort of a unified globe that can be controlled by small numbers of ultra wealthy people who will be invisible. They'll be behind the scenes, and they simply issue the orders and the idea of sovereignty and voting and democratic so-and-so, that'll all fade, and we will simply be told what to do, when to do it, and sort of the opposite of what America stood for. So we do face this very real problem, and this is a classic trial balloon. When you hear the French President Macron saying, "Look, we're considering sending forces to Ukraine to fight," and then immediately it's disowned by the U.S. and Germany and a couple of others. Oh, no! Don't listen to him. We're not going to do that. This is a classic strategy that's used by NATO over and over again, where we've seen it. We saw it with the long-range missiles being sent to Ukraine. The big debate: can we do that? And then we saw it with the heavy tanks, the M1s, the British tanks, the German Leopard tanks. We saw it with the F-16 fighter planes. Somebody makes this proposal, and everybody else says, "Oh, that's outrageous. We can't do that. We've got red lines." And the next thing, one by one, they fall in place. Once the public has been acclimatized to the concept and they've sort of simmered back down, then another country says, "Well, yeah, we could go along. We'll kick in some of those heavy tanks too." And before long, everybody is starting to do it. We're seeing the same thing happen here, because after the French president Macron made his proposal, then we saw first a little tiny Estonia. They said, "Yes, we think that's a paradigm shift in a positive way, the idea of using troops." And then the next thing we saw Poland, which is not a tiny little place. It's a a military power, significant power. They jumped on board. Then Italy came out and said, "Oh, we don't like this because it's various technical reasons." Well, this isn't a matter of technical reasons. This is a matter of whether we're going to recklessly expose the populations of all these Western countries to nuclear annihilation, to World War III, to seeing 3 or 4 people on your city block sent off to war to go and fight on the other side of the globe for something that's meaningless to the American people. So we're seeing this classic trial balloon floated by France now gradually starting to get some acceptance from the other countries to go in. And the feeling is among the elites that we got to do something, because when Ukraine falls, we're going to be the emperor who has no clothes. We're going to be standing there, and everybody had warned us that this is the most stupid venture you could imagine, to promote a war right on Russia's border with the first or second largest nuclear power on Earth, and yet they went ahead and did it, and now they're going to have to own up to the fact that they have been fools, and they have endangered the whole world. So we're entering into a very dangerous phase of the war, where Ukraine is down, not out, but it's certainly a fading power at this point. And all of the elites in Europe are beginning to see the people are very restless. Perhaps they'll be voted out of office. The government of Portugal was just turned out by conservative, sort of anti-war leaning people the other day. It just happened a day or two ago. We've seen a lot of rising up of right-wing forces that are opposed to this war in Ukraine. And when you see this, then the politicians in power become desperate and willing to do anything, however dangerous. So that's where we are. We've got to be alert, and people need to consider the possibility that what is happening is that this administration in Washington, the administration in London, in Paris, in Berlin, are seriously considering enlarging and moving us into World War III and potentially a thermonuclear war. That's all for today. I appreciate you being with us, and we will see you next Monday.